Good morning, everybody, to yet another Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School. Today we have a unique opportunity to talk with Nicholas Miller, who is going to lead us in some interesting discussion later on. Before that, I'm giving Anastasia time to give our scripture reading and prayer. Thank you, Anastasia.
Thank you very much. Today's scripture is from Ecclesiastes chapter 12 from the New King James Version. Rejoice, O young man, in your youth, and let your heart cheer you into the days of your... Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead, start again.
Okay, thank you. Chapter 12, Ecclesiastes. Remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the difficult days come and the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them, while the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are not darkened, and the clouds do not return after the rain, in the day when the keepers in the house tremble and the strong men bow down, when the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the windows grow dim, when the doors are shut in the streets and the sound of grinding is low, when one rises up at the sound of a bird and all the daughters of music are brought low, also when they're afraid of height and of terror in the way, when the almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper is a burden and desire fails. For man goes to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the well. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. And moreover, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yes, he pondered and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find acceptable words, and what was written was applied, words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and the words of scholars are like well-driven nails given by one shepherd. And further, my son, be admonished by these. Of making many books, there is no end, and much study is wearisome to the flesh. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether it is good or whether it is evil. This scripture, as we heard, concludes with the admonition, fear God and keep his commandment, for this is the whole duty of mankind. Pondering on this, it made me remember an experience that I had many years ago at Newbold on a Sabbath morning when I first heard the hymn, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And since then, when something perplexed me, or when all the injustices, the vanities, the pain, and the unanswered questions hit me, I remember that morning, because at Newbold, because as I was thinking about and all these things on my first day, my first Sabbath there among first time a Protestant institution, I heard that day, that morning, a hymn I had never heard before, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. And something profound and mystical for me, it was that indeed with the eyes of my soul, I did look upon him. upon his life, upon his commandments, about his sacrifice, and something overwhelmed me. It was a strange peace, a peace and a trust, because I realized not only, I fully realized his love and sacrifice, the kenosis, the emptiness of who he was, and he continued to be, but left it behind, at least most of it, and went through the sufferings, the misery, and the injustice of all, while he was our Savior. It revealed fully to me his nature, but also the nature of his Father, that indeed, when he said, "You see me, you see the Father," I realized that his Father was like Jesus, or Jesus was like his Father. So it gave me a great peace and really trust, that sense of unconditional love and promise. So then I realized that life was not all vanities and all for no reason or hopeless, but rather in him and his teachings, I found and renewed a new purpose. And so when I looked at his commandment, talking about commandments today and duty, I found it was more than duty. It was love and a blessing, unconditional love. So I turned to Mark 12:29-31 to see what Jesus said about the commandments. When a teacher of law, and I quote, when a teacher of law asked him, which is the first commandment of all? Jesus answered, the first of all commandments is, quote, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind and all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second like it is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than this. So today my prayer is, dear Father in heaven, we thank you for Jesus. And we pray that through your power and your grace and his power and grace and through the Holy Spirit, you empower us to indeed love and do your commandments, because this is for our best and for the world's best. We thank you. In Jesus' name we ask. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, Anastasia.
I'm sorry.
And thank you, Simona. And thank you, Jonathan Scriven, for being with us. It's a delight to see you. And of course, thank you to Nicholas Miller, who is our speaker for this morning. Now, he wears 3 hats as of now, professional hats. One of them is that he's a professor at both Andrews University and Washington Adventist University. And also, he is a member of an important law firm in the Washington, D.C. area. And also, he is related to, I'm not quite sure how, related to the Center for Law and Public Policy at Washington Adventist University. And that has a connection to Roy Branson. So the first thing I'd like Nick to tell us is, what about your relationship with Roy? Because there's a connection between the Center for Law and Public Policy and this Sabbath School class and your life. They sort of all come together.
Yes, that's right. And I know you've circulated a little story that I recently wrote for the WAU alumni magazine. So I won't go into all the details, but in a nutshell, I was a young attorney in Washington, D.C. in the early 1990s, 1994, 95, 96. And I was working on First Amendment and church state issues. And then I was at a private law firm representing especially religious institutions. But I also had a strong interest in history and academics. And So I approached Roy at the time. He was at WAU, and I'm not sure if he had started. Yeah, I think he had started the center, and I've asked Jonathan Scriven to be here because he was actually my partner in crime back then as well. Roy had an interest in connecting with young Adventist professionals and leaders and connecting them with his department. So I had an interest in teaching. I taught a constitutional law class for his center, and he recruited me to help coach their mock trial team. But also, Jonathan's just a few years younger than I am, but he had just recently graduated with his MA degree. So we taught a course together on American the history of religious freedom in America. And so we all had these connections, both Jonathan and I, with each other. And Jonathan's dad was still president at WAU for at least a couple of those years. So there was this kind of gathering of Scrivens, Branson, and I came along tagged along for the ride. And then I left after a couple of years and went to the West Coast, transferred to my law firm office out there. So we sort of fell out of touch in terms of working together on projects. I was interested in history. The time I'd spent teaching made me realize that a lot of the disputes in Washington were over either understandings or misunderstandings of history and what was the truth about our church state heritage. And so I developed a growing conviction that I would like to study. I had a degree in theology and I had a degree in law, but I didn't have a degree in history or church history. And Andrews University approached me about doing a degree in legal and religious history. And I knew that I could see the callings of the Lord in that. And so, longer story short, I went and got my PhD at Notre Dame in American religious and legal history and got to study with Mark Noll and George Marsden and some of these prominent American Protestant historians, and taught at the seminary for 15 years, but began to get itchy feet. Those of you in Southern California, and I think that's a number of you, see, I grew up there. Loma Linda Academy was my graduate academy. So to take a boy, a Southern California boy, and put him into Berrien Springs, 15 years was about all I could endure. So I was looking to get out and go somewhere, and also go somewhere where I could be more involved in public policy issues and religious liberty. And Jonathan Scriven wrote a very timely email, and it wasn't just addressed to me personally, but to a group of people who'd had connections with WAU and the center, about trying to revitalize and help build up Roy's legacy and the Center for Law and Public Policy. And maybe I'll let him talk for a minute or two here just about his connection with Roy and how he had the vision to, you guys have memorialized Roy in the Sabbath school class, and Jonathan and his colleagues wanted to do something for him out at Washington Adventist. And maybe he can just talk about that for a moment.
Sure. Jonathan.
Thanks, Nick. Very, very nice to be here. I know a lot of you know my father. So it is sort of a longish story, which I will condense. But obviously, with the relationship between Roy Branson and my dad, I grew up, with Roy a lot around the house. We did a lot of things together. And my sort of journey to WAU took me via 13 years living in France, where I ended up getting my doctorate degree. And I got a call back from a colleague of mine. His name is Brad Haas, who runs the Honors College at WAU. And in 2020, I came back, and this was COVID, right before COVID. And right as COVID hit, there was some restructuring at the university, and the Honors College that Brad and I were sort of in charge of had a few things put on our plate. And one of those was they wanted us to revitalize and sort of reimagine the Center for Law and Public Policy. Now, that was a very special thing for me because Roy started that when my father was the president. I was involved in a few of the activities and events back in the sort of late 1990s, early 2000s. As Nick mentioned, we actually team taught a class together. But eventually, we decided we wanted to sort of, as a way to really honor Roy, is to really build it up to what he had built it into, which was at one point the Adventist college that had the most declared pre-law majors of any Adventist college in North America. I was looking through some old documents. At one point, we had 67 declared pre-law majors. And that was largely because of Roy. There was a mock trial team. I think, Nick, maybe you were one of the first, if not the first coach of the mock trial team. So we've been bringing some ideas back. We're going to be announcing very shortly another tribute to Roy Branson that's going to sort of help us to attract students. I currently sit in Roy Branson's old office. His old desk is my old desk there as I teach in the political studies department. So when Nick sort of responded to my email with a sort of desire to sort of maybe get involved and help, it was like sort of like divine intervention in some ways. I'm not an attorney. My colleague Brad's not an attorney. We're trying to build up pre-law and public policy and religious liberty. And that happens to be exactly what sort of Nick's focus is. So it all sort of came together. And from a totally personal perspective, it's just such an honor and joy for me to sort of carry on Roy's legacy. And then from a professional standpoint, I'm just unbelievably pleased to try to put a program in place in a very important location, right here at the foot of the nation's capital, to encourage students who have the desire to pursue legal issues, public policy issues, religious liberty issues, etc. We want to try to create the best program we can. And so that's how the center sort of started back in the 90s with that desire. And now we're trying to sort of bring that back in a sort of 2.0 version. And it's appropriate that it was 25 years ago that Roy started the center at WAU. And now, here we are 25 years later, going to make some big changes. So we're very excited.
Wow. So what's up on the agenda for the Center for Law and Public Policy? What's in the near future and the long future?
Okay, Nick, I'll start. I'll let you finish.
Yeah, go ahead. Sure.
I think I'll. So in the very near future, we're very excited that we have, with the help of sort of Nick and my colleague Brad, we've sort of put together some funds to launch what we're going to call the Branson Fellowship. And that is sort of the first thing on the agenda in terms of something that's going to reach out to a wider community. Our goal here is to provide, fairly significant by Adventist standards, stipends for students to come to WAU, be a part of the Honors College, and work for the Center for Law and Public Policy in a way that is putting them out into the community. So putting them out into places in the Washington, D.C. area. And Nick, maybe you can talk more about that. But that's sort of the really exciting thing that's going to kick off this fall. We're also going to be continuing to push our pre-law program. Our mock trial team was on a hiatus during COVID, as many were. Nick was very gracious to come back and get that started last year. And we had a terrific first year where our regional championship was at Princeton University. So last February, we took a group up to Princeton and had an absolute wonderful time. Nick, anything else you can think of? But those are some of the immediate goals. It's about providing content in terms of educational opportunities, classes, courses, launching the Branson Fellowship, continuing with our mock trial program to try to encourage students to pursue that passion if it's so interesting.
Yeah, just to add to that, Jonathan and I are, I think that at this point, we're going to be co-directors. One person cannot fill Roy's shoes. So Jonathan and I are going to do that together. And I come from the seminary. I'm still connected with the seminary. So I have a special burden to connect the fields of theology and biblical reflection with our pre-law public policy programs. And we've raised some funds, both private legal community funds, and then some funds from the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department at the church and Liberty Magazine. And so this is not just going to be 1 or 2 fellowships, but we're aiming to have 8 students 2 from each year of the collegiate classes that will work with not just us, but also provide support, legislative aid, and research support for both the NAD and GC Public Affairs and Religious Liberty directors who are working on Capitol Hill, who are working at the United Nations. And we will be there Washington is run by student interns and recent graduates. The elected representatives rely heavily on this brigade of young people. And we want to bring a similar brigade of young people from an Adventist Christian perspective to support our leaders and representatives on Capitol Hill and kind of build bridges between the university and the church and provide Adventist young people with experiences working on both Capitol Hill and with our church. So that's what we're planning on piloting this coming fall. And so we'll see what flows from that.
Wow, that's so exciting. And Roy would be so pleased and proud of what you're doing. So let's consider the Roy Branson Legacy Sabbath School and the Center for Law and Public Policy partners in some way. We'll figure that out, but partners in some way. And you folk are faculty members of this Sabbath school. So here we go. Now, let's see, we have 3 cases today. Is there anything else you or Jonathan would like to say before we get to the cases?
No, I just think that these cases are going to be a good entryway into the kind of issues and perspectives that I think that our center can almost uniquely contribute to the conversation in Washington. Right now, we're torn between, a very rightist, almost Christian nationalistic agenda on one side and a very secular left-wing agenda on the other. And there's this dissenting Protestant voice that values both morality and freedom in ways that aren't captured by these extremes. And I'm hopeful that these discussion of these cases won't just be, dry legal discussions, but that we can get at some of the underlying philosophical and even theological convictions that give us unique perspectives on these cases. So I will just give that as backdrop.
Okay, as I've thought about it, go ahead, Jonathan. No? As I've thought about it, I think of the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States of America, which guarantees liberty and justice for all. And it seems to me that liberty and justice are somewhat in tension with each other, and that we can go too far in the direction of liberty, and Democrats sometimes do that, or we could Republicans sometimes do that, or we could go too far in the direction of justice, and Democrats sometimes do that. So you have this pushback, and these cases are not going to be resolved by considering only one thing, but by considering a number of different things and trying to strike an appropriate balance amongst them all. So the first case is Groff versus DeJoy and the United States Postmaster General. Over to you, Nick.
Yes, sure. So this is the case that Adventist lawyers have been waiting for several decades. It involves Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the appropriate legal standard by which religious convictions should be protected in the workplace. And so there's kind of a quick history here to understand the meaning and implications of the case. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects a range of features, of course, beginning with race, but then also including gender and religion. And in the early 1970s, it's become clear that it's not just religious belief, but religious practice that gets protection. But there's a case in the mid-1970s. The question is, how much protection does it get? And of course, we know that no right is absolute. None of the Bill of Rights are absolute. You can't use your religion to justify religious theft or human sacrifice. And so there's always got to be some balancing test, some weighing of things. And the language of the statute regarding religious conviction in the workplace is one of substantial hardship. So your employer doesn't have to accommodate your conviction no matter what the cost or under all circumstances, but it must do so if it can show, unless it can show that there's a substantial hardship that it will bear in accommodating your convictions. Well, that sounds pretty good, but in a case in the mid-70s called TWA versus Hardison, the Supreme Court decided in some probably careless language that substantial hardship meant anything more than a de minimis burden, anything more than a de minimis burden. And in Hardison itself, there was a union bargaining agreement that related to seniority. And they said that to cause an employer to violate seniority regulations would be an undue hardship. But they also implied that paying overtime would be an undue hardship, that putting any meaningful time and expense would be an undue hardship. And if you think of it, you know, TWA is a multi-million-dollar company, and a few dollars in overtime probably shouldn't be considered a substantial burden, but it did meet this de minimis standard. It was more than de minimis. So from that point forward, religion, even though it was protected in the workplace, was kind of a, and I won't say redheaded stepchild because I'm redheaded, but a disfavored member of the civil rights community. And so if you were protected for race, they had to show that there was some extreme need if they were going to discriminate on the basis of race. Or another good comparison was disability. If you had a disability, the employer had to show significant hardship or expense. But religion had this de minimis standard. And so we had been working as Adventist Church for decades to try to find, well, we were doing two things. We actually have legislation in Congress seeking to change, because it is a statutory standard, and you can change that by congressional enactment. So we had various versions of something called the Workplace Religious Freedom Act, which would have installed perhaps the equivalent of the American with Disabilities test, kind of a mid-level, significant burden or hardship standard. We never were able to pass that. It kept being brought back, Congress after Congress, never had the votes to pull it off. But the other avenue to try to get it changed was through the courts. And so we've sponsored a number of cases over the years to try to get to the Supreme Court and have them revisit it. Ironically, the case that does come to the Supreme Court doesn't involve a Sabbath keeper, involves a Sunday keeper. And I'm not sure if there's significance to that, right? Did our Sabbath get protected because it came in the guise of a majoritarian religious practice? I'm not sure, but there was Adventists involved. Alan Reinach from the Pacific Union, which is where many of you are, has developed a national reputation for handling workplace accommodation cases because of his role as, understanding the Sabbath and Sabbath protections in the workplace. So even though this guy, this postal worker, was from Pennsylvania, it was actually Alan Reinach that was contacted and asked to handle his case at the trial court level. And it didn't actually go to trial. It went to the summary judgment stage where it was briefed on this question of they had met the de minimis standard, and the lower courts agreed. So the case was dismissed by the trial court, and I think it was the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals caused Alan and his client to lose. Well, at that point, some national First Amendment firms that are highly experienced in Supreme Court practice got involved, Alliance Defending Freedom. And so other lawyers stepped in, and they brought the case to the Supreme Court. And this was the one that was argued 2 or 3 months ago. And we had the decision 2 or 3 weeks ago. And the court kind of split the baby in the middle, didn't give the Sabbath keeper and the plaintiff side everything they were asking for, but did move off the old standard and specifically and explicitly rejected the de minimis standard. They said, no, that was a unfortunate language that shouldn't have been used. Substantial hardship is more than de minimis. It must involve, it will certainly allow for the payment of some overtime. And they sent the case back down below for an evaluation consistent with this new heightened standard. So we don't actually know the full results of the case yet, but the likelihood is that the post office will see that they need to do more to accommodate this individual, and it will settle favorably for him. So the bottom line is that while we didn't get everything we asked for, we had a significant step forward in the court rejecting this very weak language and suggesting that the standard has to be meaningful and substantial. And this is going to be a real blessing for our church and our church members. Some statistics a few years ago said that there were two Adventists every day that are threatened with the loss of their jobs because of their Sabbath keeping in the workplace. It's more than 1,000 cases a year. Many of them are prevented by letters from parle directors, but these are usually, often, not always, but new members, new in the faith, facing a challenge to their livelihood. And so this is going to be a very helpful case, not just for Adventists, but for members of all religious groups and organizations, whether it be Jews, Seventh-day Baptists, Muslims, headdresses, all of that will be impacted by this decision. So that's the general overview of it, Dave. Hopefully I've been clear enough in where it came from and what it's accomplished, but I'm sure there will be some questions as to aspects
Maybe I
of
can
it.
ask, yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Here's a couple questions though. First, can you tell us what de minimis means? And secondly, can you tell us a little bit more about the story of this person? Because I think that's an interesting factor here. And thirdly, might you comment on the court suggestion that inconveniences to other employees must not be taken into account? So as I understand it, there is a suggestion that if providing this help release time for the Sunday keeper would be a minor inconvenience on the one hand, or a major threat to the business's overall operation. Those are the two standards. But apparently, the inconvenience of a Sunday keeper or a Sabbath keeper to other employees is not factors. Am I right about that?
Well, okay. So shall I start with that one and work backwards? So this was an issue that had been raised by the government, who felt that burdens on fellow employees should be considered as perhaps also preventing the accommodation. And the problem with that is that there's a certain amount of sometimes bias and ill will towards religious minorities in the workplace. And the court and we as plaintiffs envisioned you would get almost a sort of heckler's veto. Well, I don't want to work on weekends either. Why should that person, because of his or her convictions, have special treatment? Again, the court kind of went halfway on this one as well. They did not allow that burdens on fellow employees could itself disallow the accommodation, but they did say, insofar as burdens on fellow employees create a burden on the business itself, then that could be the basis for not extending the accommodation. So again, there could have been an argument that if the burdens on the fellow employees grow so big that it's a burden on the business, then the business doesn't have to accommodate. But you can't just have a single worker saying, oh, I don't want to do this. I don't think you should accommodate that person. You can't just take one person's opinion or general experience into account and disallow the accommodation on that basis. And I think the justification here is that, these sections of Title VII only apply if an employer has 15 or more employees, and most of them are with employees of dozens or even hundreds. And the feeling is these larger organizations have enough employees to distribute whatever burden there is in a fair way, and that shouldn't be allowed as a basis to deny the accommodation. So again, they kind of split halfway in the middle on that question. So you can take the burden on fellow employees into account, but only if it rises to the burden on the business as a whole.
Okay, what does de minimis mean?
So what does de minimis mean? I mean, it's sort of Latin, isn't it? But it means what it sounds like, very little, right? Of minimal quality, I think would literally be the Latin translation. And it just meant anything more than a small burden or hardship, which hardly equates to substantial burden or hardship. So the court was speaking with two tongues in the original opinion, and they didn't take seriously enough the statutory language. And now the court says, yes, we have to take seriously the statutory language, and our wording about de minimis should now not be considered as part of the equation.
Okay, tell us a little bit about this Groff fellow.
Yes, so he seems to be obviously to go to this level of trouble, quite a devout Sunday keeper. He was a missionary for a period of time, I understand, in Africa. I'm not sure what country, but he came back and needed to support his family and got a job at the post office. When he got the job at the post office, there were no Sunday hours. And I think there's this is perhaps this part of the story is a keyhole into some larger issues. Post office didn't run on Sundays, and this goes back a century or more, right? No Sunday mails. In a sense, they have a built-in accommodation for Sunday keepers, or they used to anyway. But they wouldn't. It was a hard time getting them to accommodate Sabbath keepers. Well, what changed that? I'll tell you what changed that. The Amazonification of our economy. Amazon was delivering every day. They created a contract, especially during the holiday season, I believe, with the post office to carry out Amazon deliveries on Sunday. Now, he was originally, I think, at a larger post office where this was happening. And so he transferred to a smaller post office where there weren't Sunday deliveries. But then after a year or so, that happened there as well. And so there was no escape from it. And he was being given points and demerits that would eventually lead to his termination. Before he was terminated, he voluntarily chose to leave and transition to another job. But even when you resign under duress, you're undergoing discipline, the courts will treat that as a constructive termination. So he was still able to bring the lawsuit. But I think for purposes of our discussion, and especially as we think about some of the other cases, I think it's very interesting that, first of all, this case was brought on behalf of a Sunday keeper. Query whether a Sabbath keeping case would have been taken by the Supreme Court. I don't know. But in a sense, Sunday keepers are a canary in the coal mine of an increasingly secularizing and capitalistic society, right? If Sunday keepers aren't having their holy days accommodated, it means that the secular capitalistic ethos of our country is really spreading and taking over, and there is no room for sacred time, whether that's the sacred time of the minority or the sacred time of the majority, right? This is a kind of symptom of the age in which we live, in which 24-hour, 7-day-a-week commerce is found not just in the commercial sides of America, but also, infecting our government here. And shouldn't we be interested kind of in that aspect of the case? It's both, there's Sabbath and Sunday issues, but there's the Sunday keeper is his experiences as highlighting the influence and impact of secularity and commercialism in an age, and this is in a sense what the Sabbath is about in part, I would hope, right? It's in saying there's this other set of values.
Okay, Jonathan, do you want to jump in on this?
No, I'm going to let Nick do the legal stuff. I will just add, I don't know if you were able to circulate a little video webinar we did. I will put it in the chat, but one of the things that we have done over the past couple of months throughout this course is we've had a couple of interviews with people like Alan Reinach and others. So the most recent one we did was actually last Friday evening, a week ago, right after the case. And I'll maybe put that a link to that video in the link, but there, Nick, as well as Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine, as well as Alan Reinach and another gentleman from the Atlantic Union talk about a few of these cases. But I'll leave the legal stuff for Nick for now, but I will put that link to the video if anyone is interested, as a very interesting in-depth discussion that we did at the Center for Law and Public Policy just 2 days after the case was handed down. I'll put that in the chat.
Okay, good. We'll put that on Facebook and on send it around in our newsletter.
That's great. Thank you.
We're going to shift now to Creative Limited Liability Corporation versus Ellenus. I think this is a court case from Colorado regarding LGBTQ rights. Let's leave the affirmative action case for another time, so we have enough time to discuss this one. So over to you, Nick. What do you want to tell us about this case? Did I lose Nick?
I was muted there for a moment. I'm just, I can see my connection is a little bit inconsistent. I've dropped out a time or two, but you can hear me now, can you?
Yes,
Okay,
and we'd like
good.
you to go on to the next case. We'll leave the affirmative action one till later. So let's deal with this one now.
Yeah, sure. So, so this is interesting. We're moving from the Sabbath to a discussion of the other institution from Eden, right? Do you see that? We believe in two institutions from Eden, Sabbath and marriage. And in interesting ways, the court has protected, and this sometimes causes a conundrum in light of our prophetic outlook, where the government is supposed to respect less our Sabbath and institutions from Eden. What do we do with the Supreme Court that seems to be protecting the Sabbath? And then in this second case, Creative 303, traditional views of marriage. So a little background on this case. It comes out of Colorado. And I'm not sure, honestly, in light of several, you may remember a case that came out several years ago from Colorado, Masterpiece Baker case. And that had to do with a baker who'd been requested to make a case for a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. And the court agreed that he did not have to. But they decided that case on such narrow grounds that there had been found in the record below intentional and overt anti-religious animus in the administrative decision-making body. And the court said, anti-religious animus is not allowed. We're going to protect the baker. But now you have a follow-up case where there was no anti-religious animus in the record, and it had to do with a website designer who was making websites for occasions, including weddings. And in the state of Colorado, there was a law that said if you offered services to anybody, you had to offer them irrespective of sexual orientation and gender identity and all of that. And so she brought a pre-enforcement action based on not the fact that she had been approached by a particular couple, but that the civil rights organization of the state of Colorado was known and would enforce these things. and had enforced them against the baker, for instance. So she was seeking a pre-enforcement declaration that her speech and religious freedom rights should prevent her from having to design a website that would be promoting and endorsing and advertising a same-sex wedding. So again, there was not a trial below, but there was a set of stipulated facts that both the government and the plaintiff agreed to, the lady who was designing the website. And given the stipulation of the facts, it's hard to see, if you take seriously the First Amendment free speech clause, how she should lose or why she should lose. And just to be clear to everyone, sometimes people say, oh, religion is being used as a basis to discriminate. Well, the ruling in this case actually had nothing to do with religion. It was based on the free speech clause of the First Amendment. And the court ruled that because the parties had stipulated that her creating the website was expressive conduct that she was involved with, that it was her design and her creativity, and that it was to promote and to work in combination with the clients that came to jointly convey an expressive message celebrating whatever activities were being advertised. And this would be done, it wasn't a cookie cutter website that would be sold off the shelf to anybody, but that it would be done and uniquely in each set of circumstances. And there was also a stipulation that she would be willing to serve anybody and everybody, irrespective of sexual orientation or gender identity, as customers, selling them items in her shop or off-the-shelf items for them to use. What she wouldn't do would be to be involved in promoting messages that went against her beliefs and convictions, irrespective of who the client was. So if a same-sex couple came and said, we want a same-sex wedding website, she would not do that. But if a heterosexual person came and wanted a promotion of something she disagreed with, she wouldn't do that either. So the discrimination was not based on the status of the individuals or the customers bringing the request. It was based purely on what she was being asked to do in terms of expressing her opinion. And the way the case came out, and I didn't actually mention this in the Groff case, and I should have, that case came down 9-0. It was unanimous in defense of the Sabbath and accommodations in the workplace, which is extraordinary in this kind of partisan environment and very encouraging. But this website design case was 6-3 and along expected partisan lines. The 6 conservatives voted in favor of the protection of freedom of speech, and the 3 liberals opposed it and said that it was a kind of discrimination. I honestly don't think, unless you're so caught up as a partisan in one side or another of the culture wars on this question, because this is a free speech case, it's hard for me to see anyone being happy with the implications of an alternate outcome. So if she had been forced to make this website that she disagreed with, then a Black website designer would be forced to design a website for the KKK or the white supremacist organization, featuring burning crosses. The atheists would be forced to support the Catholic Church's website, and on the list of horribles would go. The Muslim web designer would have to support the Zionist organization's website. Surely when you put out those kind of list of examples of what would be required, don't all of us value some level of discretion in our particular professions? Like, I'm a lawyer and I can choose. I was approached by a tobacco company firm at one point in my career. And I said, no, thank you very much. And I wouldn't choose to represent pornographers either, right? I have that discretion. Why should other disciplines and professions not have the ability to do that? So that was the reasoning and justification behind the case. Everyone argues that it's a religion versus LGBT, but really it's a free speech case in relation to ideological points of view with which one may differ, and the ability not to make that speech. At least that's my view of it and the majority of the court. So, but I'm sure there's questions.
Okay, just before we take a break, I have a few alternative cases here. So the court is saying a website designer does not have to do something that promotes something contrary to his or her beliefs, right? And that's a matter of free speech. So here are some cases. What about if the website designer is asked to do a website for an elegant gay nightclub?
An elegant gay nightclub. Is it the elegant part that's the problem, or the? Yeah, I mean, I think that this falls into clearly there's an ideological bent, or a stripping nightclub, right? Is there really a difference? And wouldn't the designer be able to refuse in both instances? A legal business, but one that goes against my convictions, I think that would probably be protected.
Okay, here's another one. Urgent care center owned by two gay physicians who have no romantic relationship. They are simply business partners. Could she or he do a website for them?
And the website is just promoting the medical the medical center. Yeah, I would think this would fall into the category, if you refuse to do this, you would be refusing to do it based on the identity of the customer rather than the expressive engagement. And so this would be forbidden because it would be identity discrimination and not ideological choices about your speech.
Okay. What about an apricot business? Here are two people growing, drying, and shipping gourmet apricots, and the website designer discovers that those who are operating this are two married women.
And are they actually shipping the apricots?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of joking, but the shipping actually could be the connection to the federal jurisdiction. Yeah, again, I think that sounds like identity discrimination, right? There's nothing. It's not like dried apricots for gay people or something that's you could make it interesting. Again, it seems identity discrimination. You could make it more interesting if you said, okay, they wanted to have their apricots shipped in the month of June in multicolored rainbow packages that had pride on it, and they were asking her to design that, right? That would be a more difficult case. And I think, again, the creativity involved and the message might provide protection. But just the fact that they're lesbian business owners doesn't allow her to not serve them.
Okay, what about an owner of a large apartment complex, and this owner will lease units to gay people?
Yeah, again, I don't think you're allowed to make judgments about other people's moral judgments. This is protecting your own creative capacities. So again, unless they're asking her to, advertise Pride Month specials or, again, if it's identity discrimination and doesn't involve your expressive communication of a message you disagree with, then you're not going to be protected.
Okay, one more. A wedding resort. There's one here between here and Oak Glen. A wedding resort that provides weddings and receptions, but it does not allow LGBTQ weddings.
Yeah, so that would be, yeah, under the court's reasoning, and it may be, so certainly churches have protections in this regard. It's a little fuzzier as to whether is the resort involved in promoting and hosting the wedding, or is it just a physical location where people come in and do their own events? This sounds to me like one of those factually specific cases that's going to involve the question of how involved the resort is in promoting the message and the wedding. But I'm tending to lean towards, given the court's reasoning, that probably, is it publicly owned? Is it privately owned? If it's publicly owned and it's a kind of corporate resort, they're probably not going to be able to. If it's privately owned and there's personal convictions of the owners regarding this, then maybe there'll be protection. But you're asking the hard questions now that are going to be decided in the courts over the coming months and years.
Okay, all I'm trying to do is to illustrate how difficult it is to balance liberty interests and justice interests. And it's not something that's intuitively obvious in every case. So I think we've demonstrated that. Just before we take a break, Monty Butler wants to jump in. Monty.
I have one other example because I was intrigued by this idea of the difference between the identity and the focus on that versus just personal conviction. So I got taken back to a wedding. So a wedding for a gay couple, they're asking for a cake to be made. So this reflects back on a case, but there are no figurines on the top of the cake. Let's just call it a plain white cake. They're asking a bakery to bake a cake for a wedding for a gay couple. Would that be considered speech for that baker?
Yeah, I think that the court would view that as not involving expressive activity. I mean, let's say it's a wedding cake that does have some expressive, there's decorations on it and it says happy wedding day. So that's expressive, but the baker isn't being required to express anything that he disagrees with. And I tend to think that he would not be able to raise a claim. Again, the discrimination would be against the identity of the people asking for it. Like if they walk in and they want to buy cupcakes or a cake that's on the floor already, and the baker says, oh, I'm not going to sell it to you because you're a gay couple, that would be identity discrimination. And that would not be protected. Now, you might change your scenario hypothetical slightly and say, well, what if he bakes a cake and the cake has his initials on it, and then the cake goes to the wedding site and everyone there knows that this baker baked the wedding cake? Could you make an argument along those lines? I don't know, possibly, but I don't think bakers put their initials on wedding cakes. And I think you're generally not going to have protection if you're not actually having to engage in speech that you find problematic or that you disagree with.
Okay, Monty, did you want to come back on that?
Well, does it mean that they have to sign that others? So is it critical that others know that the person who is speaking is the person who is speaking? And if that isn't there, then what if I'm even thinking about the website. Oftentimes a website designer does have information down at the bottom, but what if they didn't? And anyway, I'm maybe intruding in on Q&A time, but
Okay.
I think it's an intriguing thing. I think the identity thing and being able to, that's a real interesting issue. I really appreciate your bringing this up, Dr. Miller.
Okay,
Sure.
so maybe we'll put you up front in the Q&A so that you can cover this. Now, during the question and answer period, we'll deal with as many comments as people have, but if it turns out that we can, we'll turn to the affirmative action case as well. So Simona, over to you. Well, okay, it's exactly 11:30 now in California. So let's take a 10-minute break and reconvene at 11:40 in California time.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So 10-minute break. Let's not start any discussions in the break, which is unfortunately very common because we want to record everything, and I want to also give Nick time to relax a little bit. So we will be back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. We are back from our short break, and per popular demand, we are going to continue with our third case, which is affirmative action. Thank you for leading us in this discussion, David.
Okay, Nicholas, let's go straight to this. This is Students for Fair Admissions, I think, versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina. Let's see what you want to say about that. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Over to you. Okay, Nicholas, can you hear us? Oh, there you are, sure. But we need you to unmute yourself.
Guys, I sent you a request to unmute. I think we lost Nicholas for a second. I know that he mentioned, here he is. Go ahead, Nick.
All right, so I'm on my cell phone now. Hopefully this will be a little more reliable. I'm having some network problems. So yeah, the affirmative action case, and I do want to talk about this for a few minutes because I do think it relates to the Sabbath case in ways that we haven't typically thought about. And I'm at Andrews University right now because I teach a class on the covenants, the Sabbath, and the great controversy. And there's a segment, we spend a third of the class focusing pretty exclusively on the Sabbath. And we use Sigve Tonstad's book, Lost Secrets of the Seventh Day. And I think he makes an incredibly compelling case that the Sabbath has tied up in it all sorts of social justice imperatives. And you can see that in the seventh-day Sabbath itself with the instructions for not only the husband, but the wife to rest, right? You and your wife, the children to rest, but not just the children, the son and the daughter, the servants to rest, the manservant and the maidservant, and the strangers within your gates, the immigrant, the foreigner, and the animals, right? It's not that everyone's the same. There's still social distinctions and social standings, but at some fundamental religious level and an economic level in relation to labor and to work, everyone is equal and gets the same kind of Sabbath rest. And what we see in seed form in the weekly Sabbath is then further developed and manifest in the yearly Sabbaths, where every 7 years debts are forgiven, slaves are freed, the land rests, which means the animals rest. And then, of course, on the Jubilee Sabbaths, where you have the land resting for 2 years in a row, and you have the reversion of all land to the original owners. And in a society, in an agricultural society where the means of production is essentially the land, you have an incredibly intrusive resetting and re-regulation of the economic system on a regular basis. And it's an amazing balance between capitalism and, call it socialism, if you will. There's still individual effort that's rewarded. You have to work the land, you can sell it, you can buy businesses, but you can't forever alienate your children's inheritance, right? There's a constant resetting of the natural inequality of society. And that's seen, I think, so clearly. Ellen White brings this out herself in Patriarchs and Prophets in the chapter on the care of the poor. And I've had a developing and growing conviction that, Sabbath is certainly we want to worship on the day that God has called us to, and there's issues of authority and his role as creator. But it goes far beyond that in terms of how we treat our communities and work with social and political and economic issues during the week. And I thought it was quite profound that the same day the Sabbath case came down, the case regarding affirmative action came down. And it forced us in the public affairs and religious liberty community to really think hard. The temptation was to just talk about the Sabbath case and do a victory lap on the value and importance and the new heightened protections we had as a church community. But especially after the last few years, we've just become aware of how insensitive that would be to a large portion of our church community, which is minority in status and is feeling just as badly, if not more badly, about this affirmative action decision than many of us are feeling about the victory in the Sabbath case. Not only are our members impacted by these two cases, but the principles of the Sabbath should be informing the way we think about the affirmative action case. Okay. And too often,
Nick, could I interrupt you just for a second?
Yeah.
Could you adjust your phone so we see more of your head? Wow, you're handsome.
How's that?
Very good. Okay, onward and up. Thank you.
So we did a webinar that Jonathan Scriven earlier referred to, and I think has been put in the chat, where we bring these two cases into conversation and we talk about first the Sabbath case and then about the affirmative action case, but then talk about how the Sabbath principles should inform our response to and thinking about the affirmative action case. Now, with that's kind of an introduction and background. Let me just talk briefly about what actually happened in the affirmative action case. So really the roots of the affirmative action case go back to the 1950s, Brown versus Board of Education, which basically said, you can't discriminate in schools. You can't keep Black kids out of public schools. And the meaning behind that case was to try to create an equality for all Americans in access to education. But the question becomes, of course, conservatives can take a hold of this. You can't use color in deciding where people go to school, to try to use that in a sense for their own purposes, so that if the argument is the law has to be colorblind, which actually wasn't the reasoning of Brown versus Board of Education, but you can see how it moves that direction. So, Brown versus Board of Education is about treating people equally, irrespective of color. So does that allow us to engage in positive discrimination? Can we give people preferences because of the color of their skin or ethnic heritage? And of course, many of our public schools began to do that in the 1970s and 1980s. There were some Supreme Court cases that basically, to summarize them in a nutshell, you cannot have quotas. You can't say 10% of our entering class has to be Black or Hispanic or Asian. But you can, they said, in the Bakke case out of the UC Davis back in the late 1970s, you can take race as one factor in doing an overall analysis that might tip an application one way or another. And that's where the law was into the early 2000s. There was another case that reaffirmed yes, you can use race as a justification if there's a compelling interest to do so. And the court found that given the history of America's racism and segregation, that there was a compelling interest in providing a diverse educational experience. And that was used to justify not racial quotas, but racial preferences or racial character, engaging race as one of 5 or 6 items in determining admissions. But in this case, in early 2000s, the court said, this isn't an ideal thing. It should be phased out over time, maybe 20, 25 years. We need to stop this, being conscious of race and admissions. And the majority now, in the most recent case, the Harvard College and the UNC case, kind of seized on that earlier language, saying, yes, maybe there was a compelling interest in justification, but even then the court said it shouldn't last for more than 25 years. Well, here we are. The current entering class will now graduate 25 years after that decision came down. And we feel it's now time to return to a purely colorblind assessment in our enrollment procedures. So, this is a very careful and important point that sometimes the news media, which is very critical of this decision, doesn't give as much attention to as they maybe should. You still can talk about race, but it has to be about your personal experience in race in your application. So you can't get a bonus just because you check a box that says Black or Latino, but you can talk about your story as a Black young person, as a Latino young person in a community where there's been discrimination and hardship because of the racial community you're a part of. I hope I'm making that clear. You can't gain an advantage because of your membership in a racial group, but you can tell the story about your personal experiences with race. And so there is still an open door for colleges and universities to consider the role of race, but on an individualized basis and not a group basis. And I think that's significant. And if I were to give an overall reaction to this decision, I think that affirmative action is a very imperfect tool to deal with the history of slavery and segregation and racism in our country. It's a tool that penalizes or puts the burden of reparations on a very small group of people rather than spreading it broadly across the population that has benefited, if you will, from racism and slavery. So instead of saying everyone in the majority community is paying a small tax to help fund education more broadly for minorities, it means that one white person or one Asian person is denied a spot at a prestigious university to make up for historical unfairness. And the majority, in its opinion, says, does one discriminatory wrong, is it fixed by another discriminatory wrong? And I think there's something to that argument. The problem I see is that you're doing away with an imperfect solution, an imperfect kind of reparation, with no substitute in its place. You're not doing anything better. You're taking away some small effort to bring some equality and fairness. And at the same time, and I'll end with this point and see if there are immediate follow-on questions. The schools continue to do affirmative action, just not on topics of race. So, for instance, there's legacy students, and those are children of alumni. If you're a child of someone who's gone to an Ivy League school, you are given an advantage in the admissions process. So if your parent or your grandparent wasn't there, you probably wouldn't have gotten in. And the same is true for children of donors, as well as people there on athletic scholarship. There was a statistic that something like 65% of the white students at Harvard are there on some affirmative action program that isn't based on race directly, legacy admissions, donor admissions, athletic admissions, but still means that they get in on the basis of having lower grades or test scores. And those categories happen to be overwhelmingly white, right? So there's affirmative action for privileged white students, but we can't give affirmative action to historically underrepresented minorities. So I think that that's an important part of the equation that the majority, I don't think, sufficiently responds to and answers. And I think as people who care about Sabbath principles, especially with I talked about land, agricultural society. We don't live in an agricultural society. We live in an information age society. And the means of production are education. And if we were going to be wanting to emulate the Jubilee in our society, but based on the facts and circumstances we have now, we would be far more generous with funding the education of disadvantaged minorities. And this is where maybe I just drop in a comment about the student debt decision that came down the same day, that invalidated Biden's debt relief for billions of dollars of student loans. Same principle. I think the decision may have been legally correct. I'm not sure we want the president having that much power for giving billions in loans. Does that mean he can impose billions of loans with a stroke of a pen? But the larger concern is that we have a society that imposes on our younger generation tremendous financial burdens and debts that make for an increasingly unequal society. And if we reflected the biblical framework at all, we would want to provide much free or at least much less expensive education to our young people. So the Supreme Court is pro-religion in a sense, but it's really anti many of the principles underlying what I would describe as genuine biblical religion as the Bible teaches it. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Okay, just one more comment from me, and that is, I think California has outlawed affirmative action on the basis of race for many years, right?
That's correct. It was held, there was a vote, a statewide referendum on the topic. And even in progressive liberal California, affirmative action lost, and percentages of minorities at the UC schools dropped rather dramatically. They're trying other means and measures to bring them in, but they haven't returned to the levels that they had a few years ago. But yes, you're right. It's widely viewed as an unfair way of trying to right historical wrongs. The problem is we're not replacing it with anything meaningful.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Let's see, over to Monty for the questions and answers.
Okay, everybody, many of you are familiar with the fact that I changed the rules for our discussion to one comment and question or two questions, but I think we're going to have high demand today. So at least for this week, I'm going to restrict that down. If you have a comment to make and that's most important to you, you get one comment, but not a question for that time in the queue. If you have a question, then that's what you have for time in the queue. If I'm wrong and we have less demand, then I'm glad to put you back in the queue and we'll come back around to you. So one comment or one question. Please restrict yourself to that so I don't have to do the enforcement on that. And I will, in the queue, have preference for first time questions or comments and for some gender balance in our discussion. So with that, I have Simona, who had her hand up earlier, and then David in the queue. And I am skipping myself. I'll maybe put myself down further, but I already had my one question. So we'll go from there, and I'm watching for hands. Simona.
Thank you so much. This was very informative and interesting. So reflecting back to the case of the web designer, I'm kind of thinking of this in a little bit different way. So my question is this: does the web designer have the right or has to agree with everything and everyone for whom they design before decide to that they are going to work for them?
Well, I think it has to do with the message that's being promoted, right? It's not your entire catalog of beliefs of your customer. It's what are you asking me to design and promote, and am I comfortable with that message?
So you believe that they should have the right to choose, whether or not to do the work based on whether or not they agree with the message, correct?
Right. So she gave examples of other messages she wouldn't promote. Like she's anti-violence and she wouldn't promote a Second Amendment, gun rights cake, I think was one of the examples, or a Halloween cake promoting spiritualistic ideas. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you, Simona. David.
Yes, I'm not quite sure how to ask this question, but I was wondering, in the case of the postal worker and Sunday accommodation, if the same standard, do you think, would apply in the private sector as it did in this case with a quasi-governmental agency, the post office? Do you put it another way? Does the Constitution forbid discrimination in the private sector, or is that mostly for the government to set a good example, so to speak, if you work on behalf of the government or for the government?
Okay, good question. And I didn't get into all the legal background in terms of the statutory background to the case, and I can clarify that now. So this was a statutory case, a Title VII case regarding the postal worker. It was not a First Amendment constitutional case. And Title VII, I did mention it was passed in 1964. It protects against race, discrimination on the basis of race, gender, and religion. And it specifically applies to the private commercial community as well as to the government. And so there's a certain size requirement. You have to have 15 employees or more. But yes, the answer is this standard is now applicable to all commercial enterprises, not just the post office.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I've got Henry Lamberton, and then I also see Peter. So let's go to Henry first.
Excuse me, I had to unmute. When California passed the law that outlawed discrimination or admissions based on race, and this is something that I don't know. I don't want to take as something about Loma Linda or its lawyers as gospel, but my recollection is, and so I'm asking you, Nick, if this would be an option. My recollection is that we took a deliberate stand, our legal counsel, that because we're a worldwide church that makes up many nations and languages and cultures, that we had a religious basis for making our classes in medicine, for example, represent the kind of community that is supporting it. So it's really a kind of a Baki decision, but with a religious basis. And I wondered if you had a comment on whether you thought that could fly.
Yeah. So
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, finish the question.
We already have a well-protected right to discriminate on the basis of religion, which we do. But I'm wondering about the affirmative action piece.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I'm not familiar with the situation at Loma Linda. I was wondering if we engaged in affirmative action there or not, in terms of race. And I guess in California, you can't. and whether we have a religious exemption to that because it's somehow part of our religious teaching and identity. I don't know if that was tested or not. I think at the federal level, you know, why does this, so to get into the legal weeds a little bit, this was a 14th Amendment equal protection decision. So why did it apply to Harvard University? Because Harvard is a private university, but Title VI, a statutory congressional statute, basically says if you receive federal funds of any kind, then you have to abide by the 14th Amendment equal protection teaching. And I imagine Loma Linda, I'm sure our students get federal funds. So we would technically need to abide by this decision. And whether we could get a religious exemption for it or not, I don't know. But I think as a practical matter, the fact that we certainly can have religious preferences in hiring, given our church diversity and ethnic makeup, probably the fact that we can prefer Adventist students also means that we can prefer to a certain degree a minority of students, especially as we have applications from overseas, and we have a large number of second generation minorities, whether from South America or Africa or Asia, to draw from. So I would think that's why, I'm not sure how diverse Loma Linda is, but Andrews University is either the first or second most diverse university in the country. And I don't think it's because we actively practice affirmative action in the area of race. Rather, I think it has to do more with the ethnic identity and makeup of the Adventist Church, which naturally makes us reflect that identity. Probably some of the same is true at Loma Linda. But I'm not a lawyer at Loma Linda. I'm not sure fully to the answer to your question, but it's a good one.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I have a comment in regard to the post office case. Well, you presented as a kind of success for the litigant. And I beg to differ a little bit because it's not, at least it's not a total success, because it leads to the latitude of the owner to decide about if it's a real burden for its business or for the employees that he has. In other words, he is the last one to decide if he had serious difficulties in helping this man with whatever case he has, and for the employee. Then he's the last one that is deciding, because I understood that there are no any provisions to define basically what this real burden is. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I don't think that's quite true. The Supreme Court is remanding the case back, in this instance, to the lower court. They're not just returning it to the employer and saying, decide what to do. The lower court is now going to regain jurisdiction of the case, and probably now the employer is going to have to come forward to the lower court judge and say, here are the things we did, this meets this higher standard, or they won't be able to do that, and they'll probably just settle the case. So the case hasn't just been returned to the employer, it's been returned to the lower court to now assess whether the employer is correct or not. I mean, you're right, most employers in the initial instance are going to have to decide if it's a substantial burden or not to accommodate, but that's the way it's always been. And then the employee can go to the EEOC and say, hey, we think that they are not accurately deciding this, and you get court review of it. So there's still legal protections. The court will decide if the employer's decision is correct or not.
And to call it right, it will be just a partial success, right?
Well, I mean, it's a new standard that's much more protective of the employee. That's the way these cases work. It's rare that the Supreme Court will actually say, oh, you're the winner. It's often adjusting and giving the correct standards for the lower court to use. But as a practical matter, there's almost no doubt that the employee will win under this new standard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Eduardo.
Thank you. I have a question. It sounds from reading and listening about this case, sounds like it's a gain for religious liberty, but how it will turn against Seventh-day Adventists when the Sunday law will come? That's my concern, how that could be turned against us. If I remember, Sister White said that not only they are going to enforce us to not work on Sunday, but they're going to enforce us to work on Saturday. How
Right.
this can
So,
yeah.
well, I mean, so this case actually seems to point in the other direction. In other words, in this case, I mean, you have to realize that these days is the greatest threat to Sabbath observance is not the government and Sunday laws, it's private employers and capitalism. It is jobs that don't want to accommodate religious convictions, whether it be Sabbath keepers or Sunday keepers. And Title VII protects us from this private sector. Discrimination. So I think somebody needs to be muted, but yeah, so I just don't see this as a case that makes more likely or possible Sunday laws. It really doesn't. It in fact is the opposite. It enhances the protections, at least for employees in the workplace, and doesn't really have to do with the government's oversight over issues of Sunday enforcement. This is about private conscience. So,
can I add a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah, if it's related to your question, a follow-up, or related.
I hope we will. In 2017, Sonia Sotomayor made the statement that separation of church and state is no longer available in the United States. But like this decision of the postal worker, it doesn't make it government when the Supreme Court is making the decision?
Well, I think Justice Sotomayor was concerned with one of the cases that allowed some government funding to go to a religious institution. She certainly wasn't talking about this issue, and I guess I'm just I'm confused by your question. This is a case that protects private conscience against employers, and it has nothing to do with the Supreme Court deciding anyone's religious holy days. It's about them protecting individuals' holy days. So
thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. I believe Branson Legacy Sabbath School, I believe, is Simona this week.
That is true, but I am channeling McKinley right now, who cannot ask a question, and who asked me to actually share the question with you. And so he is asking about your comments about the Sabbath, calling it for a rereading of the Sabbath. along the lines of the rereading of Revelation, as Sigve Tonstad suggested. So this expansive view of the Sabbath is an interesting and it seems effective non-technological solution to the climate change question. Can you comment on this thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this for the last few years. It's been interesting that the pandemic was kind of an enforced Sabbath for the whole globe, and we saw rather dramatic environmental reversals. Dolphins swimming in the canals of Venice where they haven't been seen for decades, air and water being much cleaner. And you can see that the Sabbath, and especially the yearly Sabbaths, had a rather dramatic environmental purpose. You know, and they weren't always kept by Israel, were they? And in fact, one of the reasons they went into captivity, Jeremiah said, was for the land will now rest. And when I was at the G20 Interfaith Forum last year, and there was a Jewish rabbi talking about the importance of Sabbath principles to dealing with many of the issues we're facing, including global warming and the environmental problems. And it just made me think, as Adventists, we tend to be focused on how you know, the environment is going to be used as an excuse to justify Sunday laws. And of course, that's certainly possible. But what do you do with the fact that our Sabbath principles, if implemented in some way, not in enforcing everyone to keep a seventh day holy, but, you know, could provide a possible solution to the rather world-shaking problems that we have today? Isn't there more that we can say about our Sabbath in response to some of social and ecological ills, other than we need it to be protected for ourselves and no one else can enforce any of it? We're going to have to adjust some of our reasoning and our argumentation if it can be shown that regular days of rest are actually important and maybe even necessary to the health of the planet and people on it. You know, how are we going to argue for Sabbath principles without actually saying the government should enforce Sabbath keeping? I think it's something we're going to have to think about more creatively as these problems become more real.
Thank you very much. And if I could just add a comment to this, a personal comment, because the question was from McKinley, but my comment is that I think that there is a wider issue of justice that the Sabbath raises. Justice in terms of debt relief, in terms of environmental restoration, in terms of relationship restoration. So all these issues that we have widely neglected as a church that claims to follow the Sabbath. And we have kind of, I think we have narrowly understood the Sabbath only as, you know, a day of rest, without taking into account all the justice and environmental issues the Sabbath also, and social issues that the Sabbath also raises.
Well, I think our young people would be much more interested in the Sabbath if we made those points clear, because they see it as a day of boredom and cessation from activity, but they're all very interested in questions of the environment, ecology, and justice. Somehow, if we can bring that and make that message clearer, they may be more interested in it.
Thank you, Simona. I am going to go to Bob Ford with a first question, and Peter, I have you in my queue. Bob.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. Briefly, I worked in the federal government for a few years at USAID when Branson was, and I went to his class, so it was a great inspiration to me in my work. So I want to just mention that. But the question is, how does this whole approach deal with those who are pushing for reparations, specifically reparations for slavery? Is that something that maybe we as a church, if we're looking at Sabbath principles and Jubilee and, and restoration, redemption, is that something that maybe we ought to look at? Broader societal reparations for the wrongs of the past?
Yeah, I mean, if you read Ellen White and what she said, she used words very much like, she didn't actually use the word reparation, but she did use the word restitution for the ills done in slavery, which is really a very similar kind of word. And I do think that, when people say reparations, they tend to think in terms of getting a huge amount of money and giving it to very poor people. And that does seem to be impractical and problematic. But I think there's much more sophisticated ways of thinking about reparations in terms of access to educational benefits and healthcare and, basic societal needs that could be done with vouchers, with ways that money isn't misused and lost and stolen and so on and so forth. And I think cases like this affirmative action case highlight the fig leaves that we've used so far. You might call affirmative action a fig leaf, like we're trying to make up for decades of completely unequal treatment by putting a few minorities in very elite schools. There's problems with that. But just to take the fig leaf away without addressing the larger underlying inequities that have existed and seriously we gave reparations to those Japanese that were in internment camps in World War II, but we still haven't done reparations for slavery, despite the promises of some presidents along the way. And it's a huge issue. It's much bigger than our church, and it's a politically divisive one, right? As soon as you start talking about reparations, you're viewed as a left-wing woke warrior. But I think our Sabbath principles should cause us to view the whole thing much more sympathetically than we do.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Peter, and then I've put myself in the queue.
Yes, a comment in regard to the affirmative action. Well, you used an expression that is bothering me a little bit. Positive discrimination. And in my view, discrimination is discrimination. Positive, negative, whatever it is discrimination. And I know that the affirmative action, as we mentioned the case in 50s, now it will be 70 years approximately since that was promulgated. And talking about the justice, I mean, discriminating against a group and favoring another group is not exactly promoting the equality that the civil rights were based on when Martin Luther King was promoting the idea of merit, not skin color or anything else. Then even at Harvard University, their policy that is based on those that are making bigger donations to be accepted, their children or grandchildren, is not just. It should be the same principle. Everybody should be accepted according to its merits. But still, if we want to help a little bit those that are less fortunate than those that are doing better in this country, it could be found another way or ways to still help a little bit these people, but still merit to be used, because hard work should be rewarded. This is a very important principle in the society. And one way, in my view, to help a little bit these people will be, let's say, about the tuition. And let's say a university is asking $60,000 per year for a student. Well, we can make it less money, to pay less money for those that are less fortunate. And I'm sure that some other things could be found to help a little bit those that are less fortunate. What do you think about?
Well, I mean, you made quite a lengthy comment there. What do I think? I think that discrimination happens all the time. Whenever schools choose classes, they discriminate on all kinds of things, including wealth and the ability to pay. Clearly, as you've noted, there's all sorts of legacy discriminations that take place. And so I think it's unfortunate that the court singles out this one area of discrimination, which helps historically disadvantaged, mistreated, and abused populations, and says, but that's the kind of discrimination we can't do. We can discriminate in favor of mostly white legacy admissions and mostly white donors, but this other discrimination, that's the wrong kind. Well, I think that's a very inconsistent message, and I wouldn't want to be found defending it. Who's next?
All right.
Thank you. I agree with you. Discrimination is discrimination, no matter how.
Okay, we've got quite a line coming up, so I just want to clarify. Stephen with the first question, then me, then Simona, then Henry, then Eduardo. Let's see, Stephen.
Just an observation and a comment that in universities, the admissions discrimination, to your point, comes in all kinds of forms. I'm reminded when our younger son was applying to universities and had the occasion to sit with an admissions officer in one of the Ivy League schools, and in a moment of, I think, probably candor that he may have regretted later, but he simply said, "We'd love to have your son in this incoming class, but the fact of the matter is we need a tuba player." And,
Yeah, well.
I mean, I was dumbfounded and astounded at the comment, but I began to realize the inequities that occur behind the scenes on admissions on just a whole spectrum of dimensions that we're not privy to. And so, you're bringing to the fore, so those are that are much more obvious and much more prevalent. But you're absolutely right. The discrimination takes all kinds of forms, most of them unaddressed.
But still, the people, I guess, with color have more been discriminated.
Okay. So a comment. Nick, did you want to respond to that?
No, I think it's a true point, and we're not going to get away from there's a word that's often used, invidious discrimination, right? Discrimination has to happen on all sorts of fronts. The question is this discrimination being used to unfairly exclude certain individuals on a basis that they shouldn't be excluded on, or including people on a basis that they shouldn't be included on? And I think that the affirmative action of historically underrepresented minorities should not be considered an invidious form of discrimination. It's trying to make up for huge inequities in the past. And until we find better ways of doing it, we shouldn't be tearing down the imperfect ways.
Very good. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm gonna jump into the queue here, and Anastasia, I will add you into the queue. So given that the Supreme Court has said that we can't use this form of affirmative action, I hope that schools and other institutions will develop other forms of affirmative action. are we at risk of the Supreme Court saying, no, you can't use those forms of affirmative action, either, for example, things related to a person's economic status or experiences like that?
They seem to keep open the possibility of, as long as this was about race neutrality, as long as your criteria is race neutral and doesn't involve some other protected category, then yes, you could help a certain economically disadvantaged group. One of the things they've done in California, I have a good friend who's an education professor, and in California, what they did was they made a rule that at all the high schools in California, the top 5% in each senior class would be guaranteed admission to a UC school. Now, so you can see there that a number of schools might be high minority schools, 90%, close to 100% minority school in a poor district. And maybe none of those kids would get into a UC school if they were just lumped in with all the students across California. But by saying the top 5% of each class can go in, that then your schools that are highly minority schools are going to send a certain number of students. And so they've used some tactics like that. And remember, as I discussed the case, they did leave open the ability to use discussions of race in your personal statement. So you can't just have them check a box which says Black or Hispanic, but you can have them talk about growing up in an underprivileged community, experiencing discrimination. And if you can tie your community's discrimination to your own experiences, then that can be. And so creative admissions counselors and high school counselors hopefully will encourage and direct their students to tell these personal stories of discrimination.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have hope that we'll find creative ways like that and continue to work on them. Anastasia, I'm bringing you in as a first question this week, and then I still have Henry and Eduardo and Simona. I'll be putting you in between those two. So Anastasia.
Thank you so very much, and we really feel privileged to have you. My question has to do with capitalism and taxation. I think it's a fact that for the probably 20 years, the richer become richer and the poorer are becoming poorer. And isn't it discriminating that school districts with minority, especially Black, but also all underprivileged and other poor and underprivileged families, and now including even middle-class families, that their taxes go to that particular neighborhood. Therefore, Black, colored, neighborhoods of color and poverty and even low middle class have a much inferior educational system, less educated teachers and educators in their public schools. Therefore, they're even more disadvantaged on top of all the years of slavery and so on and so forth. So I appreciated, number one, I appreciated very much your comments on capitalism, extreme capitalism, that we're seeing the tuition going more and more and more and more, where the rest of the world, Europe, even little Greece has free education. And here is getting, the times that I came to this country and I was in school at the UC system, I walked out with zero loans, where my sons, even with grants because of their scholarship and good grades, walked out with a lot of money. So debt. So capitalism, and then even extremely has hurt even more the minorities, the Black people, the Hispanic people, the underprivileged people, and getting lower education because good teachers are not recruited there. Thank you. And what is your statement, your opinion?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. Unfortunately, in the last 50 years, free enterprise capitalism has become the 11th commandment of American evangelicals. Or it could be the 12th one, maybe the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. I can't decide which, but I do think that that the tremendous inequities, even from the 1970s, America was a very egalitarian nation. But after the Reagan years, our levels of inequality in society and the gap between the rich and poor are on the par now of South American countries, right? The top 1% control tremendous amounts of wealth. And it has a direct impact on our ability to sustain our educational systems, our middle class. And your point about education being local at the county level means that fairly wealthy states, doesn't matter how wealthy the state is, it matters how wealthy the county is. So poor minority counties have very poor school systems, and then rich counties have very well-to-do educational systems. And again, we live in an information age culture, and the means of production really is getting education. And if we were to follow the biblical principles of the Jubilee, we would see to it that education is much more fairly funded across the board, and view that as part of our Sabbath belief system, right? That we wouldn't fall into this evangelical right-wing free enterprise capitalism and as the solution to all problems. There's got to be a balance in it. And Ellen White herself, the prophet, used to talk about this in Patriarchs and Prophets. So shouldn't we be able to, as Adventists, and not be accused of falling into partisan politics? So yeah, I agree with you.
And isn't that how we also obey the commandment, the most important after loving God, to love our neighbor as
One another.
thyself?
Yep.
Thank you, Anastasia. Okay, we're getting close to the end of our time. I have Henry, then Simona, then Eduardo, and I'm going to close the queue at that point. After Eduardo, I'm going to come back to Simona and see where she would like us to go. Then my guess is ending. But let's go with Henry, then Simona, then Eduardo. Henry.
I want to make a comment about the complexity of having admission standards. I was on the School of Medicine admissions committee for 27 years and watched how good of predictions MCATs and GPA scores were, and all of the predictors that we could get. There is some predictable, statistically significant predictability. If someone comes in with a very high MCAT and a very high GPA, they are less likely to have to repeat a year or to fail boards. But the one thing that is well established is that board scores, national board scores, are not significantly predictive of how well a person functions as a resident or physician. A study in academic medicine in 2011 looked at all of the looked at multiple performance evaluations that were available, 360 evaluations, et cetera, and then compared them with board scores, part one, and there was no statistical significance in predicting which ones would get the better clinical evaluations. So the whole issue of what kind of standards are you going to use is very complex. And I hope that with the door that was left open by the Supreme Court, that a student who can say that they overcame hardship and that's a quality that is predictive of lots of things, would be able to be accepted if that hardship was race.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Good standardized tests are good predictors of, of test taking often.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
They often don't measure more soft features and virtues like emotional intelligence, which can be a very important part of being a physician, right? And so you can't do away with the test taking, but it seems to me there's plenty of room for diversifying the kinds of skills and virtues we're looking for, and diversifying them in a way which is more receptive to minority communities, perhaps.
And just obviously you have to have a minimum amount of knowledge. It's that idea that MCATs would have no validity would certainly be wrong. But
right,
we're looking at people that have met a certain threshold.
Yeah, agreed.
Thank you, Henry. Simona.
Well, you often talk about equity, and I think the Supreme Court often talks about equality. These are not exactly the same thing.
Right.
If you take Usain Bolt and me, put us both on the start line for 100-meter race, I think there is no question who is going to come first, right? But so the issue here is, I think, the issue of equity. How do we give this possibility to people who have no possibilities given to them before, so they can achieve their full capacity? And, you know, I often worry about how many extremely talented people we will never see and never know about because they have never received the possibility of good education. And this approach, the approach of equity rather than equality, I think should be a guiding principle for all Christians.
Yeah, I mean, so equality is giving people equal opportunity, just to understand your comment, and equity is actually giving them equal opportunities to succeed, perhaps, is a way of putting it. I mean, equal outcomes will never happen in a world where there's a differentiation of talent and willingness to work and so on and so forth. You know, Ellen White talks about this, you know, no one will ever be fully equal and have the same amount of money. But we do want people to have both equal opportunity, but also not everyone, as you've pointed out, starts, it's not a level playing field. They don't start at the same place. And often the reason they're not starting in the same place is because of mistreatment that has occurred by the majority community. So for there really to be equal opportunity, we need to spend some time and resources sometimes to put people who we have hurt in the past into a more favorable position so they can actually compete on an equal basis. And too often Christians are slow for some reason at seeing that. I think because we've bought into this individualistic, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and individual effort will save the day. And of course, there's a certain amount of truth to that. And all the professionals on this call, and you know, we've all had to put in time and effort and energy, but many of us were advantaged in ways, not necessarily economically. My parents weren't rich at all, from humble backgrounds and church workers, but they were part of a culture of literacy, of reading to their kids, of valuing the importance of education in ways that other communities haven't been given the opportunity to do. And when I applied myself to education, doors were open to me because of the way I look and talk and the cultural cues I'm able to pick up on. I'm more easily able to overcome the hurdles that are in the pathways of the professional race than people from other cultural or ethnic communities and backgrounds. And I think we need to be more sensitive to that at times as Christians.
Okay, Eduardo.
Thank you, Monty. Dick, I already pray to the Lord that I will reward you for your help that you are giving us and you are giving to the church. Your hard work of understanding. And I need your help a little bit here. I hope it may relate it to the issue. In the early 1900s, 1906 and 1911, Pius X wrote encyclica in regard to the Republican government of France and Portugal. And in that encyclica, it says the separation of church and state is a vicious and pernicious separation, which is, we have said, reduces the church to a shameful servitude. And by our apostolic authority, denounce, condemn, and reject the law of separation of church and state in the Republic of Portuguese. And my question that I carry for many, many years is how the Catholic bishops of America are waving the flag of religious liberty. If their leader, their documents are pretty much against religious liberty in the form of separation of church and state, because if you read the whole encyclicals, they want the church to rule the government because Jesus gave them the power over the kings of the earth. Help me to, how can I understand that American Catholic bishops are waving the flag of religious liberty in the case of the Little Sister and others?
Right. Well, I mean, if you've studied the history and the history of the Catholic Church, you know that it's a very flexible organization, right? I mean, it can respond to and modify its views depending on the time and the place and the culture that it's in. And in America, you know, we've had Vatican II since then, which seemed to involve some genuine broadening, modifying of some at least external Catholic presentations on some matters, including religious freedom and the separation of church and state. But I would think that the Catholic bishops in America, their view of religious freedom and the separation of church and state is a pretty pragmatic one, right? When you have a secular government, which we largely do now, especially under a democratic administration, the separation of church and state can become a very important tool to protect the church from secular ideologies and policies. And so they're in favor of it. Now, if the government were to change and you had a much more Christian nationalist kind of leadership, I'm sure you would find them probably softening on those principles and moving back towards a more historic position in the church. So I'm not trying to pick on the Catholic bishops here. I think all institutions tend to move towards a policy that favors their own interests, and sometimes even the Adventists do that. You know, we've talked loudly about the separation of church and state at times, and I don't think we've always understood what it fully means. But I guess more recently, and even I have become somewhat more flexible when you live in a very secular society and the public schools are very secularized in terms of sexuality, gender, and creation. Maybe we should be a bit more open to having tax funds go to students who then have a choice to use them in religious or public schools. So yeah, the Catholics are very pragmatic in their church-state outlook, and it wouldn't be hard for them to revert to perhaps a more medieval outlook given the right government situation. But then we have a certain amount of pragmatism in us as well, and maybe we shouldn't throw stones too hard their direction, though we can certainly call them out on their inconsistencies where it's appropriate, and we should perhaps call ourselves out on it as well. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Nick. I would like to come back to Dave, just because, Dave, you kind of got us going, so you may have something where you'd like to bring us to an end before we turn it over to Simona.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you to Jonathan. I would like to just momentarily build on what Simona said, and that it seems to me our goals should not be equal outcomes, And neither should our goal be equal opportunity, but equitable opportunity, fair opportunity, not equal opportunity, because we cannot provide that any more than we can provide equal outcomes, but we could provide opportunities that are more equitable. Okay, that's all from me. Over to Simona.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for your participation, and particularly thank you, Nick, for taking your time to talk with us about these important issues. I hope you will be able to stay with us after this for maybe a few more questions and discussion after we finish our formal part. As it is usual, I like to end our presentation and our meeting here with some thoughts. And today I would like to read two quotes, one from Benjamin Franklin, another from Robert F. Kennedy. Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are. And R.F. Kennedy said, few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. And I hope we can emulate these ideals in our daily lives in the week to come. Our blessing for the week. God's arms enfold and protect you. God's word inform and inspire you. God's love infuse and transform you. God's spirit flow and empower you now and always. See you next week. Thank you.